Hallo Asta. Hallo Ayungi.
Ayun nga kanakpin.
Ayungi lang ako yan. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you here with me today. You are an archaeologist and a PhD researcher at Copenhagen University and a associate professor at Berkeley University as well in Scandinavian studies. And you have recently published your first book. I was so excited to see the title, and I really wanted to talk to you more about your findings and what you've been working on.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out. I'm so happy to hear that someone is on a mission to let people know about our beautiful country and our beautiful language as well. And I grew up in Uummannaq in the very northern part of Greenland. And I grew up looking at these cultural remains in the landscape. You can see them so clearly, and yet not really knowing what it was. And I remember one time my father told me, "You were actually standing inside a winter house." And I thought, what is he talking about? I'm standing inside a house? How can that be? And he lifted me up on the walls and he pointed, these are the walls of the house and this is most likely the entrance. And I was looking at this grassy landscape and I could see this dip into the landscape where the room of this house would have been. And I remember thinking, okay, this is definitely not recent. They did not move out yesterday, but they lived in the same area as me because I could look out onto the water and see the Uummannaq mountain inside the big fjord. So they were looking, their view would have been my hometown. And in my hometown, looking out, I would have been looking towards them. So there was something about that reflection, sort of back in time, but at the same time in the very same location that I called home, right? So there was something about how much can I get to know about their way of looking at this world by studying their house, but also by studying their oral stories. So the stories they told that oftentimes were collected between 1735, when some of the first missionaries arrived in Greenland, and all the way up until 1981, where Maliar Wilbeck collected some of the stories also in the southern part, also close to you. I think it was in Ottohotto. What I was interested in during my PhD was how those two sources could talk together, so to say. So the archaeology with the house remains we see in the landscape, together with the oral stories that were told by the Inuit themselves. And the stories oftentimes, they were legends, big stories about Gästesuk, for example, or Anganguyungwa. So oftentimes many things and many dramatic things would happen, but they would also describe the landscape or how you need to come about into the house, for example. So when I first looked at it, I could see you had some rituals, for example. The first time you stay in the new house that you had built. So you have come together, build a house out of stone and turf and sometimes of whale bones, but also driftwood. And it's the first night you're sleeping inside that house. Then you had to light the soapstone lamp, the qulluq. And if the little sort of fire, it would be steady, it would mean that this is going to be a house and a place that can nourish you. You can get food here. You're gonna catch seals, birds, foxes. You're gonna thrive here. But if the flame was flickering too much, it was sort of warning you, this is not gonna be a steady place for you. So maybe find another place, right? So it's sort of superstition, but also taking advice, so to say, from the land that is just trying to take care of you. Right? So it was very interesting for me to delve into these stories and I learned something as an archaeologist that I had never thought about before, because whenever we have excavated a winter house, for example, we know, okay, this is the entrance, this is where a window could be, this is where they could sleep on a sleeping platform, and some objects have been dropped inside the house, right? But I would never think of the house as a being or as a human. And that is the idea that came from the oral stories, because the ancestors of the modern day Greenlanders, they would mention that the house has an illupsollua, so the nostrils of the house. So the house needs to breathe, right? Isn't that amazing? And then you have a dolluk, right? So this part, and the door was called the dossor. So is that a coincidence? Or does the house entrance, which was very long, it could be from 3 to 6 meters long, and you had to crawl through that space to get from the outside into the inside of the house. So it was more or less a throat to the house, right? And then you have the Isikivik, the view from the house, is connected to Isik, the eyes, right? So the eyes of the house was, of course, the windows. So it's amazing to think about the linguistic traces that we see in the house connected to a body. So the house has a body or a face, if you think about it. And that the elements of the window, the throat, and the nostrils of the house was always on one side, on one wall of the house, on the front wall. So you would never have a window on the back wall. That wouldn't make sense. Just as people don't have eyes on the back of their heads, right? So there's something so beautiful about building a house, but at the same time, it's a creature, right, that you're interacting with, and it's protecting you, because when you crawl through that entrance, you come from the outside, which might be cold and dark, and maybe it's noisy if there is a strong wind, and then you crawl through that space into the interior of the house, and it's cozy and warm and light, and the noises have been stilled. So just amazing to think about how it could also be close to the word of Ilya, so the uterus, and Illu, not necessarily a coincidence again. So it was very fascinating to learn this as an archaeologist, because that's not a thing you think about. But combining the oral stories with the archaeology is like, what can we learn when we combine these two things? And can we ask some new questions based on the things that we have just learned? So that's more or less what my new book is all about. The things I learned on 3 different levels. One level was inside the house. One level was right outside the house, sort of in the space between the other winter houses. And then another space was in the very landscape, where you also find graves and the caches where you, the meat caches, where you would store your freezer for your meat over the winter. And what would people be doing in those different spaces? And it was interesting to me to learn that the beach, for example, as an archaeologist, you'd think of the beach in the winter settlement that, it's easy to come from the sea ice on your dog sledge onto the beach so you can get up to your house. So it's a natural harbor. And it's very easy just to, that's it. I don't need more labels on that. It's just a natural harbor, right? But when I looked at the oral stories, for example, I could see that the beach was also the area where the Inuit would, if they were afraid of someone coming to their settlement and scaring them off or killing them or giving, sort of sending a dubilak towards them, sending bad spirits to come and harm them, they could either send the Angakbok, the sort of shaman or a spiritual advisor, right, to the beach, or they could do it themselves. And on the beach, they could recite some spells, and they could pour out some urine, and they could also lay down an amulet, something to protect themselves from the dangers coming from the outside. And then in some of these stories, it is told that a dubilak was arriving to the settlement, and on the beach, the stones, the stone pebbles on the beach, they arose just like big mountains and crushed that dubilak. So the beach is taking care of you. And I think that's such a different perspective to get from the oral stories, that this is a space that's also protective towards the inhabitants, and it's not just a natural harbor. It is also a natural harbor, but it's not only that. So I think that was so cool to learn, because this is not something my mother or father could tell me. So this sort of knowledge that we were then relearning in a way by sort of consulting or asking the questions about what did this space mean to you, mean to us, you know? So that was a beautiful journey. Yeah.
And it sounds like it meant a lot. Like, it sounds like you really, the way you described it, I really felt like you gave such a vivid picture of how one could enter this house and what the house would have meant, such an interior experience, and with the crawling in and the eyes looking only one way, and the beach protecting you. It's such vivid imagery, such aliveness somehow. Very different than there's a beach and there's a house. And it's wonderful to hear this sort of, it's almost like whispers from the past.
Yeah.
Of how one might have experienced being there, or thought about living there in the house and outside the house and in nature.
Yeah.
What incredible work to be extracting from oral history.
Yeah.
And
I think exactly when we are sort of consulting the sources, asking what did it mean to be in this space for these people, we get to understand what it meant for them, and try to see it from their perspective. And of course, we also need to consider that Greenland is such a huge country. So of course there can be differences between the different regions, what stories and what sort of traditions or practices was present in one area did not necessarily mean that it happened all over Greenland and also at the same time. So we need to consider that, of course, but it's definitely still so insightful to get to know these testimonies. And another big point in the book is that these stories were labeled as being, myths and legends. And a myth is oftentimes something that is pure fantasy, right? And there's no real knowledge connected to those fantasies. But the stories here, they do have knowledge within them. They have knowledge about practices, about the house, about how to sort of be in conversation with the landscape, understanding the animals. And if that is not knowledge, how could you survive in an area like Greenland for such a long time?
So it comes with practical knowledge as well, like when to hunt or what to not eat, and
Yeah.
yeah.
And sort of sometimes it would tell you what is scary. Like you would say the tide has a monster. There is a tide monster. So you would tell your kids about a tide monster that will come and eat you, swallow you up whole, right? And that might sound like the boogeyman, right? But if you have ever been in Greenland, you know that the tide comes quickly. And it can take up kids if they are just playing along the beach side. So the tide is a true danger. So it's knowledge embedded in those stories. And I was really curious about how can I look at the knowledge connected to the houses, to the cultural remains that I work with as an archaeologist. So it was in that sort of gap, or that space combining those two sources.
Yeah. And I imagine as well the extreme Arctic weather, how quickly it can change, and how sort of harsh the conditions must have been to survive such a landscape, and to have these guiding stories with you through generations must have been very much imperative to keep on protecting yourself and your family.
And I mean, definitely the stories would be passing on knowledge, but they would also be entertaining, because we're talking about a time where we don't have TV and iPads and YouTube. So the stories also had the purpose of being entertaining. And some of the stories were also meant to be sort of bedtime stories. So someone would be telling the stories to put the kids to bed inside the house. So some of the stories might be very repetitive, just saying, and then he went back onto the ice and he caught the same amount of fish, and then he arrived back. So it was supposed to be boring, right? Because the function of the story was to put kids to bed. But when some of these stories were collected from people from the outside, who came to write these sources down before it was too late, and thankful for that. But some of the stories were later edited, because it was boring to have a story that is so repetitive. But that is because now you're supposed to read it, and you're not supposed to fall asleep. So there's something also in the format that you're working with. Are you working with someone who's supposed to be reading this story, or someone who's supposed to be listening to a story in a space where it's social, and you can maybe also work with your voice? Like, and then he came to bed, or da da da, something like that, right? So there's something about the media as well, in which you're telling these stories, and the function of the stories, of course.
You can lose quite a lot of information there, can't you? Like, how did you figure out that these stories were supposed to be longer? You said they might have been edited from their original version to what we have recorded today. How did you figure out?
I figured that out because I had to read the sort of background story of how these stories came about. When were they collected? Who collected these stories? How much can we trust their translation, for example? And what was the point of writing these stories down? And in that process, I learned about some of the stories that had been edited. So in a sense, that forced me to look at the sources that I was then sitting with, that these had been fragmented. They were not whole stories necessarily. Some of them would have been longer, or some of the stories, the collector might have thought, well, we have 3 stories, they're almost similar, so let's just merge them into one, right? But then you lose dialects if you're looking at the language, for example, which I imagine you'd be very interested in. But you might also be losing knowledge about what was important in this town compared to that town. So things could be lost in translation, so to say.
Literally.
Literally. So I try to focus on what can be said about the house, for example, something very concrete. I try to be as specific as possible because the database I was working with, there was 2,280 stories that had been collected, and I just possibly could not read all of them just to see what do they say about the house. So I had to look at the specific keywords. And I had to pick out, okay, house or entrance or window, roof, stuff like that. Elements connected to the house. How can I find knowledge connected to these areas? And that also told me that in the entrance tunnel, for example, the where you had to crawl in, you also had to pour out some water, some fresh water, as I remember, because then the sea animals who would be killed, they would feel invited into the house. And the first time you kill a seal in Greenland, you also need to give it some fresh water, right? Just like when you have a visitor coming to your house, you ask them, do you want something to drink, right? So that's more or less the same gesture you're showing the animal that you have just killed, because before people thought that killing an animal is not just a proof of the hunter having some good skills, but it's also the proof that this hunter has sort of sent out some good energy, if we can sort of give a parallel to that. That you have treated your wife well, you have not beaten up anyone, you have not been overfishing, for example. So you sort of have a good karma or good aura, or I don't know how to compare that, but the sort of energy you're sending out into the universe, and the universe is giving you something back in terms of these animals. That is, and the animals are allowing you to kill them, so you can eat their meat, you can use their blood, you can use their intestines, you can use their bones, and to pay that animal respect, you're using all of everything from that animal. Because you are sort of saying, you are just a being just like me. And that sort of also comes from the idea that there was reincarnation in the pre-colonial beliefs. So a person would keep catching the same seal over and over again throughout all of his lifetime as a hunter. But the humans would also have a name soul, an atil. So when a person dies, you need to pass that name on to someone else so that name soul can continue to live. And maybe you also have this in your family. It's still very common in Greenland today that you call a newborn after someone in your family or someone from your community that has died recently. And that comes from that idea of reincarnation.
Yeah, my middle name is part of my grandma, so yeah, I recognize. I didn't realize the thing with the animals. I hadn't heard about that bit. That's so wonderful to hear, because that sort of makes sense with the human names or talks going down in generations, that the animals do the same, and that you sort of have a relation with like a hunter would have had a relation with a particular seal spirit. And it's sort of I'm really happy that you're sharing these findings, because I think they're such treasures for me personally to hear, but also to share with other people interested in Inuit culture, or even people ourselves who might not know these things. So yeah, I'm so grateful you were able to share. Can I ask you, just out of curiosity, do you see any of the little things that you have found that you might do yourself, or that you could see other Inuit people taking on? I was thinking about the candle. Like, next time I move, I should just check with the candle. Not because, like, maybe not that I 100% would believe it, but just as a sort of reminding myself that maybe there's an energy in the house, and to reconnect with something. Do you have little rituals for yourself, or any you could share?
I'm not sure if there is a ritual in that sense, but I really like the idea of the house being a sort of body in itself, and that with our own bodies and with our loved ones' bodies, we're trying to take care of them as much as possible, being healthy and, have strong bones and stuff like that, right? And to think about that in connection to a house as well, when you move into something, I think, and thinking about the house as something that needs to be able to breathe, right? I need to air out my apartment because the space I'm living in, that needs to breathe too. And in a way, you're taking care of that space, but you're also taking care of yourself, right? Allowing yourself some fresh air. So I think that's such a beautiful idea. And I think because these stone and turf houses, they were very organic, so the sort of walls would fall down a little bit, just like with our own bodies, right? We also decay very slowly. So something about like aging, and okay, so whenever you moved into a new winter house, you can fix things and give the house a little facelift, right? And I think there's something beautiful about that. That it is organic and it is natural, and we can take care of ourselves in so many ways. I think that's something I think it's worth taking with us. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Definitely. If people want to know more, read your book, or find more about your work, is there any place you would like to invite them to?
Yeah, I think right now I'm at the University of Copenhagen, and sometimes I give talks on various elements, various things I find in my research. So I try to reach out whenever I can, and here on November the 2nd, I'm going to be on the Arctic Festival at the Christianshavn. But I'm sure there's also going to be other talks, and maybe some of them will also be live streamed or something like that. Yeah, and there is one, it's almost a very, very long documentary that's on YouTube, where it's about why the houses in Greenland are so colorful, and it comes around both colonialism and modernity, and the many nuances and sort of dilemmas in the transition from a pre-colonial into a colonized landscape, and what the changes means to people who still live there. And I also think that is important, but it's very long. But I think one can jump in it if you want to. Yeah.
Yeah, I shall make sure we link that with this video as well, for sure. Oh, I'm so happy you were up for talking to us today, and I'm really glad you were sharing all this with us. Thank you for your work, and of course I'll also link to your book.
Ja,
tack och lov.